The rain in Astoria, Oregon, rarely falls in sheets. Instead, it exists as a perpetual, chilling mist that clings to your clothes and sinks into your bones. Daisy Hughes stood shivering on the cracked asphalt of Ashbury Lane, staring up at the towering, slate-gray Victorian house that now, inexplicably, belonged to her. Her grandfather, Arthur Hughes, had been dead for 3 weeks. He was a man Daisy barely knew, a reclusive, eccentric former engineer whom her mother, Miriam, had cut out of their lives 20 years ago. Miriam always claimed Arthur was paranoid, a man whose mind had fractured after his wife's early death, leaving him to rot in a house he had turned into a fortress. Yet, when the sleek mahogany doors of Carmichael and Associates law firm opened, it was Daisy who was handed the iron key, not Miriam. He was very specific, Miss Hughes, the attorney, Jonathan Carmichael, had told her, pushing a heavy manila folder across his desk. The estate, the house, the accounts, they bypassed your mother entirely. He left a singular instruction: Daisy must be the one to open the house. Daisy must go alone, now. Pushing the rusted key into the heavy oak door, Daisy felt the first pang of real dread. The lock clicked with a heavy, metallic thud, and the door groaned inward, exhaling decades of trapped, dust-choked air. The interior of the house was a monument to obsessive isolation. The windows were boarded from the inside, letting in only thin, dusty slivers of gray light. But it wasn't the darkness that unsettled Daisy. It was the noise. The house was alive with a low, rhythmic heartbeat. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Arthur had been a master clockmaker before he retired, and it seemed he had filled his solitude with his craft. Hundreds of clocks, grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, brass carriage clocks lined the walls, all perfectly wound, all striking in unison. The sheer dedication required to keep them all running suggested Arthur had not been a frail, forgetful old man, but someone intensely, frighteningly focused. Daisy spent the first 2 days simply clearing pathways through the labyrinth of stacked newspapers, old radio equipment, and mechanical parts. She slept on an air mattress in the parlor, jumping at every creak of the settling floorboards. It wasn't until the afternoon of the 3rd day that she noticed the anomaly. She was standing in the 2nd-floor hallway trying to match the floor plan Jonathan Carmichael had given her to the actual layout of the house. She measured the hallway from the top of the stairs to the far wall, 22 feet. Then, she went into the master bedroom that ran parallel to the hall and measured the same wall. It was only 16 feet. Daisy frowned, retracing her steps with a tape measure. The math didn't lie. There was a 6-foot gap between the hallway and the bedroom, a space that didn't exist on the blueprints. A void. Her heart hammering against her ribs, Daisy approached the hallway wall. She tapped the faded floral wallpaper. Solid wood. She moved 2 feet down. Tapped again. Solid wood. She moved another 2 feet. Hollow. It sounded like a drum. Daisy ran her hands over the seam of the wainscoting. Arthur was an engineer. He wouldn't just plaster over a room. There had to be a mechanism. She looked at the nearest clock, a heavy mahogany piece bolted directly to the wall beside the hollow spot. She reached out, grasping the wooden casing. It didn't budge. She opened the glass door protecting the pendulum and felt along the inside edge. Her fingers brushed against a small, cold brass lever. She pressed it. With a grinding groan of unoiled hinges, a 3-foot section of the wall popped outward by an inch. Daisy wedged her fingers into the crack and pulled. The heavy door, disguised perfectly as the wall, swung open, revealing pitch blackness. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, Daisy stepped into the hidden room. The air here was stale, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. The beam of her light swept across the small, windowless space, revealing a room that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic hoarding of the rest of the house. This room was meticulously organized. 4 filing cabinets stood against the far wall. In the center was a heavy oak desk, clear except for a single brass lamp, a magnifying glass, and a large, leather-bound ledger. But it was the walls that made Daisy's breath hitch. They were covered in maps of Astoria and the surrounding coastal highways. Red string pinned to locations, faded Polaroid photographs, newspaper clippings sealed in plastic. It looked like a police precinct's murder board, only decades older and obsessively maintained. Daisy stepped closer to the wall, shining her light on the largest newspaper clipping in the center. The headline, yellowed and curling, was dated October 14, 1988. Local teen, still missing. Search for Abigail Prescott enters, third week. Abigail Prescott. Daisy knew the name. Everyone in Astoria knew the name. It was the town's most famous tragedy. A 17-year-old girl, the daughter of a local fisherman, who had vanished on her way home from a diner shift. Her body was never found, no one was ever charged, and the town had eventually swallowed the grief and moved on. Why was her grandfather obsessing over a cold case? Daisy sat at the heavy desk and opened the leather ledger. It wasn't a diary, it was a logbook. Page after page of tight, precise handwriting. November 2nd, 1988. Mayor Sterling's vehicle spotted at the old quarry. Mud on tires noted a discrepancy in his public alibi. Police Chief Brody dismissed the inquiry. June 15, 1992, followed Brody to the county lines. Cash withdrawal of $5,000 from the community fund. Paid to Thomas Sterling's fixer, a man named Gregory Finch. The pages went on for years. Arthur hadn't been paranoid. He had been investigating. He was tracking the movements, the finances, and the lives of the most powerful men in Astoria, specifically Thomas Sterling, the wealthy, beloved former mayor who still owned half the commercial real estate in town. But then Daisy opened the bottom drawer of the desk, and the narrative in her mind violently shifted. Inside the drawer sat a small, velvet jewelry box. Daisy popped it open. Nestled in the faded silk was a silver locket, tarnished black with age. Daisy carefully pried the locket open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman with bright, hopeful eyes. Engraved on the inside of the sober casing were two initials, A.P. Abigail Prescott. Daisy dropped the locket as if it had burned her. A wave of nausea washed over her. Why did her grandfather have the missing girl's jewelry? The implication was terrifying. What if the maps, the ledgers, the obsessive tracking of the police, what if it wasn't the work of an amateur detective? What if it was the work of a killer keeping tabs on the investigation? What if Arthur had been framing the mayor to cover his own tracks? Panic setting in, Daisy pulled out her phone and dialed her mother. Miriam answered on the fourth ring, her voice tight and clipped. Daisy, I told you not to go to that house. Mom, I found a room, Daisy breathed, her voice shaking. A hidden room. Mom, he had Abigail Prescott's locket. He had a shrine to her. There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. When Miriam finally spoke, her voice cracked, devoid of its usual sternness. Get out of there, Daisy. Leave the keys on the counter and drive back to Seattle. Do not dig anymore. What did he do, Mom? Tell me, Daisy demanded. He destroyed our family, Daisy. He was obsessed. He saw things that weren't there, and he made dangerous enemies. I took you away to keep you safe from him. Just leave it alone. The line went dead. Daisy didn't leave. The doubt gnawed at her, but the sheer volume of the evidence Arthur had collected didn't point to a guilty conscience. It pointed to a desperate, lonely crusade. She needed the whole truth. She spent the next 24 hours scouring every inch of the hidden room, reading every file. The ledger mentioned a final piece of evidence, referred to only as the anchor. If anything happens to me, the final entry read, dated just a month before Arthur's death, the anchor remains in the foundation. Only blood can unearth it. The foundation. The basement. Daisy descended the creaking wooden stairs into the cellar. It was damp, smelling heavily of mildew and earth. The floor was poured concrete, but in the far corner, hidden beneath a pile of rotting canvas tarps, Daisy found a distinct square where the concrete had been chipped away and replaced with heavy wooden planks. She pried the planks up with a crowbar, revealing a heavy steel floor safe embedded in the dirt. It had a 6-digit combination dial. Only blood can unearth it. She tried her own birthday. Nothing. She tried her mother's birthday. Nothing. She sat back on her heels, the cold seeping through her jeans. What did he mean by blood? Family? Then it hit her. What had caused the fracture in the family? What had started Arthur's obsession? She thought back to the date of the newspaper clipping, the day Astoria lost its innocence. October 14, 1988. Daisy reached out with a trembling hand and spun the dial. 10188. She gripped the heavy iron handle and pulled. The locking mechanism clicked, and the heavy door swung upward. Inside the safe lay a thick, waterproof lockbox. Daisy hauled it out and popped the latches. The first thing she saw was a microcassette recorder. Beneath it was a sealed, plastic bag containing a heavily blood-stained denim jacket. And beneath that, a stack of original, signed documents. Daisy pressed play on the recorder. A burst of static hissed through the speaker, followed by the terrifyingly calm voice of Thomas Sterling. "You're a nuisance, Arthur. You think because you saw something in those woods, anyone is going to believe a grieving, eccentric clockmaker over me? I own the police. I own the judge. You breathe a word of what happened to the Prescott girl, and Miriam won't make it home from school tomorrow. You understand me? You stay quiet, and your daughter lives." Daisy stopped the tape, the blood draining from her face. She opened the documents. They were bank transfers, land deeds transferred to Police Chief Brody, and a handwritten confession from Gregory Finch, the mayor's fixer, detailing exactly how they disposed of Abigail's body at the old quarry to protect Thomas Sterling's son, who had drunkenly struck the girl with his car. Arthur wasn't the killer. He was the only witness. The locket in the desk drawer hadn't been a trophy. Arthur had found it at the scene before the corrupt police could sweep it away. He had known the truth, but Thomas Sterling had threatened the only thing Arthur loved more than justice, his daughter, Miriam. So Arthur made a terrible, agonizing sacrifice. He played the part of the crazy, paranoid hermit. He alienated his daughter, allowing her to hate him, allowing her to leave him and move far away where Sterling couldn't reach her. And while he sat alone in the dark, hated by his own family, he spent 30 years meticulously building an airtight case against the most powerful men in town, hiding the evidence in the very walls of his home, waiting for the day he died, waiting for Daisy to inherit the key. He knew she was far enough away and strong enough to finally finish what he started. Daisy didn't call the local Astoria police. The next morning, she drove 3 hours straight to the State Bureau of Investigation in Portland. She walked into the precinct, slammed the waterproof lockbox onto the desk of Detective Robert Gable, and refused to leave until he listened to the tape. The fallout was biblical. Within 48 hours, the FBI and state police descended on Astoria. Thomas Sterling, now an old man living in luxury, was arrested in his country club. The old quarry was excavated and the remains of Abigail Prescott were finally brought home. The town was torn apart, its dark underbelly exposed to the national media. But for Daisy, the only thing that mattered was the phone call she made to Seattle. When Miriam arrived at the Astoria police station 2 days later, she looked a decade older, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had read the reports. She had heard the tape. "He let me hate him," Miriam whispered, collapsing into Daisy's arms in the sterile hallway of the precinct. "He let me call him a monster for 30 years. Just to keep me safe. He loved you, Mom," Daisy said softly, holding her mother tight. "He built a fortress to protect us. And then he gave me the sword to tear theirs down." Daisy never sold the house on Ashbury Lane. She kept it, fixing the rotting wood and letting the sunlight back through the boarded-up windows. She kept the clocks wound, too. Every tick and tock was no longer a sound of paranoia, but a reminder of a quiet, relentless love, keeping time until justice was finally served.